Sup, dog? This is the second chapter of Darrow Schecter's The History of the Left, Theoretical Perspectives. Might be called From Marx to the Present. Who fucking knows? It was suggested at the end of Chapter 1 that Marx's legacy continues to be somewhat ambiguous because of the association of his name with the former USSR and with manifestly non-democratic forms of state socialism elsewhere in the world. On the one hand, Marxism can still reasonably claim to offer the most systematic explanation available of the mechanisms of capitalist exploitation and the circumvention of democratic political norms by organized private interests. On the other hand, Marxism in power has almost always been far less liberal and less democratic than the liberal democratic systems Marx criticizes for being insufficiently emancipated from arbitrary power relations. Hence, the ambiguity alluded to refers to the incongruent relation between Marxist theory and actual communist practice. The Bolshevik interpretation of Marxism that eventually triumphed in Russia, and which contributed to the lurch of the Russian Revolution in an authoritarian direction, seemed to many observers at the time to be a plausible translation of Marxist theory into revolutionary practice. While it is clear that Marx would have had very little sympathy for the Bolshevik dictatorship, it is also evident that there are unresolved issues in Marx's account of historical materialism, dialectics, and history which complicate any analysis of the relation between Marxist theory and communist practice. Marx is reputed to have rejected all over-schematic models of his theories and even to have quipped that he was so opposed to such endeavors that he was, quote, not a Marxist, end quote. Against all notions of mechanical causality implied by the base superstructure model, Marx and Engels consistently maintain that the economic base is only the determining factor shaping the legal, political, ideological, and cultural superstructure, quote, in the last instance, end quote. Yet, as Perry Anderson remarks, there is a tension, if not a contradiction, in Marx's historical materialism. There is a tension between a theory of history with scientific aspirations as expressed in the preface and introduction to a contribution to a critique of political economy published in 1859, and a concept of history based on class struggle and political strategy as expressed in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. In a frequently quoted passage from the preface and introduction of 1859, Marx maintains that, quote, in the social production of their existence, men enter into definite necessary relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production corresponding to a determinate stage of development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which there arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond... Yeah! All right. The production of material life conditions, the social, political, and intellectual life in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, it is their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or what is merely a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within the framework in which they have hitherto operated. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. At that point, an era of social revolution begins. With the change in the economic foundation, the whole immense superstructure is more slowly or more rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. If the scientific dimension in Marx's thought strives for objectivity and exhibits certain affinities with structuralist explanations which tend to abstract... that was the end of a quote. I don't know if I said that. I'm spacing out. If the scientific dimension in Marx's thought strives for objectivity and exhibits certain affinities with structuralist explanations which tend to abstract from the dynamics of individual motivations and collective action, the transformative dimension focuses on subjectivity, consciousness, and concrete questions concerning institutions and organization. Hence, the epistemological issue discussed in the first section of Chapter 1, addressing the philosophical mediation between humanity, subject, and nature, object, are of central relevance for an understanding of the political mediation between A, theory and practice, and B, nature and history. Following Hegel, Marx always stresses that the relations between subject and object, base and superstructure, and history and nature are dialectical rather than evolutionary, mechanical, or one-sidedly linear. The authoritarian turn of the Russian Revolution and the evident lack of revolutionary consciousness on the part of the majority of the Western European working class compelled the theorists considered in this chapter to consider these questions anew. The outbreak of World War I was a painful reminder that apart from relatively isolated groups of workers, what one might call a communist consciousness was mainly prevalent amongst avant-garde intellectuals. After the 1914-18 war, the usurpation of revolutionary politics by the Bolsheviks in Russia and elsewhere raised the question of the role of the intellectual in the revolution. Indeed, one of the chief concerns of Western Marxism is to re-articulate the role of intellectuals, politics, and culture in such a way that a revolutionary consciousness ceases to be the domain of a highly unrepresentative elite, which can then evolve into a bureaucratic caste of authoritarian rulers as happened in Russia, China, Cuba, and elsewhere. Hence, a central aim among Western Marxists is to highlight questions of politics and culture without jettisoning the primacy of the economy suggested by historical materialism. In the case of Marx, it is possible to regard the tension between objectivity and subjectivity as a potentially fruitful one, but the majority of theorists active in the years between Marx's death in 1883 and the collapse of the Second International Workingmen's Association in 1914 were probably less successful in re-articulating the relationship between philosophical rigor and political practice. Second International Marxism is known for being particularly indebted to a mechanical vision of history predicated on a fatalistic understanding of the inevitable crisis of capitalism and the equally inevitable coming of communist consciousness and an emancipated society. That is to say that in the years leading up to the great catastrophe of 1914 to 1918, the dialectical tension between subjectivity/practice and objectivity/knowledge is resolved one-sidedly in favor of the latter, resulting in the elaboration of a wide variety of evolutionary and positivist models of scientific socialism. Whereas Marx attempts to build on Kant's discovery that all objectivity is mediated by subjectivity, as well as Hegel's demonstration of the converse, Second International Marxism tends to neglect the key role of subjectivity and consciousness in the constitution of the objective world, and the transformation of the world in creative labor and social struggle. The obvious corollary of ideological scientism at the theoretical level is the bureaucratization of the institutions of the workers' movement at the practical level, i.e. theoretical as well as practical sclerosis, in which the epistemological pseudo-objectivity and political passivity seem perfectly to complement each other. This chapter focuses on the attempts by a group of original and influential theorists to reinvigorate dialectical thinking and revolutionary practice by rethinking the role of subjective experience, consciousness, culture, and other aspects of society and politics that are usually associated with the superstructure in Marxist thought. In hindsight, it appears that this corrective became necessary at the theoretical level as a result of the enormous impact of the book Capital and the mature Marx's analysis of what he considers the economic basis of society. His emphasis on the economy as the key instance of mediation between humanity and nature helped contribute to the widespread perception in and outside socialist movements in Europe and the rest of the world that Marxism is science concerned with the, quote, laws, end quote, of capitalism rather than a philosophy of human emancipation. It also became urgent at the practical level as a result of the militarist fervor accompanying the outbreak of the war and the post-war crises in Italy and Germany. Not only had proletarian internationalism been upstaged by nationalist chauvinism, parliamentary democracy, although in crisis, was ceded to fascism and authoritarian populism rather than libertarian communism. The general aim common to the diverse theorists of Western Marxism is the aim to restore the dialectical tension initially promoted by Marx by emphasizing the role of subjective and cultural factors in the revolution. In addition to nationalist consciousness and fascist politics, Western Marxists had to grapple with the manifest shortcomings of Russian Marxism and the eventual triumph of Stalinism in the one European country where a communist revolution actually occurred. This, of course, produced a series of deep divisions within Western Marxism itself concerning the question of whether support for the USSR should be unconditional or conditional, or if support should be qualified by critique. While the critical theorists considered in the next chapter are skeptical about Soviet communism and Russian Marxism, the Western Marxists are loath to abjure the October Revolution of 1917. They are keen to find an alternative to both subjectivist putschism and the political passivity resulting from the fetishism of objectivity characteristic of the writings of Plekhanov, who lived from 1856 to 1918, and Bukharin, who lived from 1888 to 1938. Hence the first question is, how much restoration of dialectical tension between base and superstructure could be undertaken within a theoretical and practical framework still recognizable as Marxism? The question is at the center of the life and work of the most influential of the Western Marxists, the Italian Antonio Gramsci, who lived from 1891 to 1937. It might in fact be argued that Gramsci is the prototypical Western Marxist. He was a renowned theorist as well as a co-founder of the Italian Communist Party, Partito Comunista Italiano, PCI, in 1921. In contrast to the academic bent of some of the critical theorists considered in Chapter 3, and in contrast to the non-Marxist theorists and activists to be considered in later chapters, Gramsci is both a Marxist theorist and political militant. His work demonstrates an acute sensitivity to the particularity of the conditions prevailing in pre-revolutionary Russia, and a simultaneous awareness that revolution in the West would have to be guided by a different theoretical and practical framework from that which worked for the Bolsheviks. This awareness sets him apart from other Western Marxists to be considered here, such as Georg Lukács and Louis Althusser. Lukács living from 1885 to 1971, and Althusser living from 1918 to 1990. So an analysis of Gramsci's Marxism will occupy a central place in this chapter. The problem of the superstructure reconsidered. 1. Gramsci, hegemony, civil society, and intellectuals. While the tendency of Marxism to degenerate into pseudoscience is palpable across the continent during the years of the Second International, it is especially salient in Italy. Achille Loria and Enrico Ferri developed schematic brands of historical materialism, simplifying the work of Darwin and Marx into evolutionary dogmas. The reformist and revolutionary wings of the Italian Socialist Party, Partito Socialista Italiano PSI, founded in Milan in 1892, were guided by fatalistic perspectives which tended to view the revolution as inevitable. For the reformists, it would be the inevitable result of a series of reforms destined to transform capitalism into democratic socialism, but for the revolutionaries, it would be the result of the cataclysmic breakdown of capitalism towards which capitalist society was automatically hurtling. The reformist position in Italy and elsewhere was inspired by Edward Bernstein's Evolutionary Socialism, published in 1890, in which the German Social Democrat argues that several of Marx's main theses have to be called into question. In addition to contesting the labor theory of value and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, Bernstein disputes the idea that capitalist society necessarily polarizes into two hostile camps, comprising an increasingly small number of monopolists and an increasingly large number of impoverished proletarians. Bernstein concludes that the struggle for socialism has to be guided by the evident reality that capitalism is not preordained to self-destruct or spontaneously generate a revolutionary working class consciousness, and that a socialist consciousness could only result over the course of a slow process of reforms and patient educational work with the masses. Filippo Turati and the PSI's reformist wing applauded the idea that there was an evolutionary road to socialism. Italian socialists hoped that the winning of concessions from industrialists would educate the masses and gradually increase their understanding in the workings of the economy and its possible transformation. Bernstein's theses helped bring on what subsequently became known as the, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Philosophers such as Benedetto Croce, who lived from 1866 to 1952, began questioning the epistemological status of historical materialism. Croce argued that in its endeavor to be objective and materialist, Marxism had turned its back on the idealist demonstration that reality is simultaneously subjective and objective. While rejecting Bernstein's reformism, George Sorel, who lived from 1847 to 1922, was persuaded that evolutionary socialism had the great merit of altering Marxists to the importance of rethinking questions of consciousness and action. In Sorel's Reflections on Violence of 1908, he maintains that if Bernstein is correct in seeing that capitalism could indeed be reformed, the prospects for revolution depended upon the revolutionary intransigence of the proletariat and its determination to forge a new set of values. Violence, he argues further, is a great catalyst of solidarity and collective action in that it propels people beyond the strictures of calculation and personal interests which threaten all social movements with integration into existing institutions. According to this theorist of anarcho-syndicalism, socialism would cease to constitute an alternative to capitalism if it could not harness the primitive spirit of violence and revolt to the project of overthrowing the capitalist system of production. The origins of Western Marxism can be located in Italy in the attempts made by Antonio Labriola, who lived from 1843 to 1904, to help solve the crisis of Marxism by insisting on the Hegelian, i.e. philosophical origins of Marx's thinking about creative labor and Marx's stress on the importance of understanding the historical and social processes mediated between humanity and nature. Without agreeing completely with Croce or Sorel, Abriola acknowledges that Marxism had become positivist in epistemology and reformist in politics. As a consequence, a possible end to the crisis depended on Marxism once again becoming dialectical in epistemology and revolutionary in politics. Labriola clearly anticipates Gramsci by locating the degeneration of Marxism in the pernicious tendency in academic circles, as well as in political movements, to treat the superstructure as a mechanical product of the economic base, when in fact the superstructures of modern capitalist societies exhibit their own dynamics and offer possibilities for creative political intervention in the workings of the base itself. Labriola suggests that the act of identifying consciousness as the key to this creative political intervention in the economy is not tantamount to siding with Croce and urging a return to Hegel and idealism. In contrast to some of the more schematic pronouncements on historical materialism made by Engels, Labriola regards communism as a possibility and not as an historical inevitability. History and a certain level of development of the productive forces opens the possibility of a society freed from material necessity and political oppression, but the realization of that possibility depends on laboring individuals becoming aware of the possibility and acting on it. Although correct in this assessment, Labriola is not really able to show how this call for a reassessment of the relation between theory and practice could actually lead to the transformation of the social world. His ideas nonetheless point beyond the crisis of Marxism in a manner analogous to the way in which Feuerbach's ideas hint at steps beyond philosophical idealism and humanism without actually showing how to get there. Whilst Feuerbach's ideas prove to be a decisive factor in the evolution of Marx's ideas, Labriola sets the stage for Gramsci. We saw in Chapter 1 that when investigating the phenomenon of Bonapartism, Marx analyzes the historical conditions under which the state can emerge as a force in its own right, gaining relative autonomy from the dominant economic class. The implication is that there cannot be any automatic corollary between the economic interest of the dominant class or classes on the one hand and the structure of the state on the other. Gramsci deepens this insight and develops an articulation of what he refers to as the primacy of the ethical-political moment of the class struggle. That is, Gramsci retains class struggle as the materialist basis of his analysis of social power while insisting, like his compatriot Machiavelli, that politics is a terrain of liberty on which decisive choices between different possible regimes are enacted. Although a given level in the development of the productive forces makes an array of political choices possible, for Gramsci, economic forces are not determining or decisive in the last instance. The increasing capacity of humans to utilize the forces of nature in order to satisfy human needs does not produce any determinate form of state, and indeed, as Gramsci was to experience personally, can culminate in fascism rather than a liberated society. Gramsci arrives at a theory of the primacy of politics within a Marxist framework on the basis of a careful reading of Machiavelli, Croce, and Marx, and also as the result of a career as a political activist which began in his youth as a Sardinian nationalist. In 1911, he left Sardinia for Turin to study linguistics. He joined the PSI and wrote articles for the socialist newspaper Avanti, and in 1919 co-founded the review Ordine Nouveau, New Order. I think Avanti might have been edited by Benito Mussolini. I'm not sure. The review became the theoretical counterpart of the factory occupations that spread through Italy in 1919 and 1920. When the occupations failed to result in a communist revolution, Gramsci, with a number of other comrades, left the PSI to set up the PCI in Leghorn in 1921. In the years 1922 to 24, he worked for the Third International, established in 1919 following the Russian Revolution of 1917, in Vienna and Moscow, and then assumed leadership of the PCI in 1924. In Italy, Mussolini, who lived from 1883 to 1945, came to power in 1922 and began quickly dismantling the institutions of parliamentary democracy and imprisoning or murdering their political opponents. After the assassination of the PSI deputy Giacomo Matteotti in June 1924, and the subsequent crisis of the Aventine secession, it was no longer possible politically to coexist with Mussolini. One had to be either one of his subordinates or an enemy. In November 1926, Gramsci was arrested and sent to prison. Shortly thereafter, he began working on his great theoretical contribution to Western Marxism, the Prison Notebooks, which he wrote in prison from 1928 until he was physically too ill to read and write, which was around 1935. Thereafter, his health quickly deteriorated and he died in 1937, just 2 weeks after being released. Gramsci's experience of fascism convinced him that a given level in the development of the forces of production does not guarantee any determinate political outcome. This may seem obvious today, but it was not at the time of the second, 1864 to 1914, and third, 1919 to 1940, internationals and the manipulation of Marx's ideas, first as Marxism-Leninism and then as a result of the power struggles within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU. In the Prison Notebooks, Gramsci attempts to reconsider the relations between base and superstructure by analyzing the ways in which culture, consciousness, and politics influence forms of state and the constant negotiation between the forces of labor and capital. The notebooks cover a wide range of topics, including literature, philosophy, Italian history, and the role of intellectuals in the class struggle, and the related issue of the shortcomings of Second and Third International Marxism. His prodigious work on these topics was smuggled out of Italy to Moscow after his death and then brought back to Italy after the end of the Second World War by Palmiro Togliatti, who lived from 1893 to 1964, Gramsci's successor at the head of the Communist Party of Italy. Togliatti insisted that Gramsci's ideas would guide the strategy of a communist party which by the 1970s was attaining anywhere from 25 to 33% of the vote in national elections, and which was firmly established in regional governments and urban politics throughout the country. The prison notebooks were published in Italy in the early 1950s. Translated versions reached the rest of Europe and North America in the 1960s and 1970s, after which a large body of interpretations came into existence. His work has been commented upon by Togliatti and theorists inside the PCI, as well as scholars such as Norberto Bobbio and other intellectuals of the contemporary left in Europe as Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Although the notebooks are open to a number of different interpretations because of their richness and complexity, a number of key themes unite the various topics of Gramsci's analyses. Gramsci carefully studied the history of Italian unification, known as the Risorgimento, as well as hitherto existing forms of radical socialism in Italy and France, most notably syndicalism. He designates the expulsion of Austrian, Spanish, and French political authority from the Italian peninsula in 1861 is an incomplete revolution, or in the terminology of the prison notebooks, a passive revolution. Stated briefly, the idea of a passive revolution is that things must change in order for things to stay the same. Examples might include the New Deal during the Depression years in the USA, fascism, and even Thatcherism. The concept of passive revolution is linked with Gramsci's understanding of the class structure of modern capitalist economies. He argues that capitalism is a dynamic system in which the different factions of the economically dominant class are in a constant process of fusion, separation, and recomposition, and that oppositional classes are also constantly changing and reforming on new bases. This compels the dominant classes not only to push the forces of production forward and increase the level of material prosperity, but also constantly to recast the institutional terms according to which the compromise between capital and labor is enacted. This means that if control over the means of production is to be maintained, the political institutional framework in which the compromise between labor and capital is enacted must change. He stresses that this continual recasting, recomposition, and reformation, reformation of institutions is not a mechanical process which can easily be explained in terms of changes in the structure of the economy or, quote, the state, end quote, in the restricted sense of government and law. It affects and is affected by all areas of civil society and culture in the broadest sense, right down to our daily making sense of tradition, codes, monuments, customs, and unwritten rules that hold society together. Following the philosopher Giambattista Vico, 1668 to 1744, author of The New Science, Gramsci regards these codes as constituents of common sense. He attributes a great deal of importance to common sense in terms of the way individuals and classes interpret social reality and are prepared to accept or not accept given forms of authority as legitimate. In the particular case of Italian unification, it is clear that in contrast to the successful revolution led by the Jacobins during the French Revolution, the Italian bourgeoisie that spearheaded the Risorgimento was able merely to bring about a passive revolution which did not change common sense or educate the masses in the duties and obligations of a liberal bourgeois version of citizenship. The Italian bourgeoisie managed to expel foreign occupiers and unite the country under the leadership of the House of Savoy in Piedmont, but it was not hegemonic. More will be said about this key concept below, but for now it might be remarked that the new Italian elites who came to power in the period of 1848 to 70 had to rely on a number of strategic compromises with the papacy, the aristocratic landlords of the South, a newly emerging class of industrialists, and the Savoyard monarchy, in order to consolidate their power under the banner of democracy and national unification. In ideal typical terms, the new state, civil society, and common sense should have been characterized by competitive individualism, diversity of opinion, and a well-established culture of freedom of assembly, debate, and the press. Instead, the post-unification political class was plunged into a desperate attempt to achieve two objectives. In the interest of stability, it had to blur the differences between the discourses of liberalism, national unity, and popular democracy on the one hand, and on the other it somehow had to cope with the reality of the large-scale exclusion of the masses from state institutions as well as the enduring semi-feudal structure of the South. In their, quote, heroic, end quote, period, the French and English bourgeoisie were apparently able to overcome aristocratic and popular resistance in order to convert most of society to the principles of the market and a competitive worldview, and thus establish their power and authority on a solid foundation that made them hegemonic. Whereas hegemonic classes transform all social relations and establish their power by remodeling the entire social structure, a class that comes to power on the basis of a passive revolution will have to negotiate and renegotiate the socio-economic and political foundations of its unstable rule. Passive revolutions can be utilized by a hegemonic class to counter an insurgency on the part of subaltern classes, or they can be symptomatic of the unsuccessful attempt of a class to become hegemonic. In reference to the Italian case, the Risorgimento is a clear example of the second scenario. The bases of bourgeois power had not been established definitively. This meant that a revolutionary alliance of the working class and peasantry could overturn the corrupt parliamentary regime whose legacy is bound up with the name of Giovanni Giolitti, and the decidedly illiberal politics of bribery and buying favors that prevailed during his years in office as prime minister. During the factory occupations of 1919 to 1920, Gramsci thought that this historical possibility might become revolutionary practice. His optimism was fueled by the Russian Revolution just 3 years before, and what he perceived to be the complementary roles played by political party and workers' council in the events of 1917. By political party and workers' council in the events of 1917. In the pages of the journal Ordine Nouveau, Gramsci and other members of the council communist movement in Italy at the time, such as Togliatti, argued that the lesson of the Paris Commune and the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917 was not only that the working class cannot lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. I would be really, really cautious to say that Palmiro Togliatti was a council communist. That's just me. The working class had to become hegemonic rather than temporarily victorious in a passive revolution, as the Italian bourgeoisie had done in the Risorgimento. This meant it would have to make a decisive break with all institutional and cultural vestiges of parliamentary corruption and behind-the-scenes bargaining for favors and privileges, and strive instead for the construction of an entirely new producer civilization. Prior to the prison writings, Gramsci was influenced by Sorel and syndicalist ideas about revolutionary politics that stressed the need for the proletariat to assert its own values in strict separation from other social strata. Conceived in these terms, the revolution brings about an intellectual and moral reform affecting the producer in every aspect of his or her life. This means going well beyond issues of wages and hours in order to take up questions of creativity and work, democracy and culture, intimacy and friendship, and even heroism and death. It is in this profound sense that the revolution entails changing the institutions mediating between humanity and nature, and as such changing the structure of experience and the content of common sense. It is in this context, too, that one can understand the battle for hegemony as a political project to establish legitimacy and authority beyond power and domination. Syndicalists in Italy responded positively to Sorel's notion that the organized working class has to insist on absolute non-participation in state institutions. Many of them were of Southern origin and were able to perceive that there was no, quote, winning the battle of democracy, end quote, in parliamentary or electoral terms. The newly created Italian state consolidated the extra-parliamentary alliance between northern industrial capital and southern landowners, in fact undermined a truly popular and democratic political culture in Italy. In 1919-20, Gramsci is in broad agreement with Marx and Sorel that the real bases of power in parliamentary regimes are extra-parliamentary. Gramsci is also adamant that the trade union, like the political party, is too integrated into the democratic parliamentary state to be a potential source of a new hegemonic order. Like the union, the council has the virtue of operating on the shop floor, where production is organized and a decisive component of common sense is forged. Like the party, however, the council unites workers beyond distinctions. Factory councils were set up by the Italian government during World War I in an effort to propel production forward by increasing flexibility in the outmoded structures of capital-labor relations based on cumbersome unions and intransigent employer organizations. They continued to exist in the post-war period and soon evolved into vehicles of radical shop floor democracy, with the possibility of transforming defensive worker contestation into worker control and autonomy. This placed the councils on a collision course with the employers and the state, as well as the pre-existing socialist parties and unions. The latter correctly perceived that the step from defensive opposition to autonomy would make them redundant. A wave of factory occupations led by the councils paralyzed the Italian economy during 1919 and 1920. In his Ordine Nouveau articles at that time, Gramsci argues that the council represents a radically democratic alternative of participation and collective decision-making capable of replacing the liberal democratic state. Not only does the council fuse producer functions and citizen function, as Marx claimed the Paris Commune did, in Gramsci's estimation, it also changes common sense by providing an institutional framework for the already existing but ultimately powerless forms of solidarity organized by the traditional organs of the socialist movement, such as unions and parties. In addition, the cultural pages of Ordine Nouveau attempts to foster a creative and experimental attitude towards the arts, and indeed, during the high points of the occupations in September 1920, workers occupying factories throughout Italy performed plays inside the factories. Friends and family supplied the striking workers with food and fresh clothes if and where it was possible to get past the police guards patrolling the factory gates. By locking themselves into factories, the occupiers set out to demonstrate the workers' determination to lay the foundations of a new proletarian state separate from the liberal democratic state. Within the factory, the council was meant to be the nucleus of an entirely new producer's civilization. I really like that word, producer's civilization, with its own ideas about labor, arts, ethics, friendship, and mortality. The failure of the occupations to bring about the Italian equivalent of the Russian October forced Gramsci to rethink his ideas about the state and revolution. The employers and state simply allowed the workers to occupy the factories, while the PSI stood by and helped sabotage the movement by publicly disparaging it as foolhardy adventurism. With Togliatti and Amedeo Bordiga, who lived from 1889 to 1970, Gramsci left the PSI in January 1921 to found the PCI. Shortly before his incarceration in November 1926, he wrote essays entitled, quote, Notes on the Southern Question, end quote, and, quote, Some Aspects of the Italian Situation, end quote, in which some of the themes of the prison writings are clearly anticipated. He argues that in the more advanced capitalist countries in Western Europe, the dominant classes possess political, cultural, and institutional resources which they did not have at their disposal in Tsarist Russia. This means that even the most serious economic crises do not necessarily have immediate political repercussions in the realm of the superstructure, or as he put it in, quote, some aspects of the Italian situation, end quote, politics always lags considerably behind economics, end quote. This raises some of the key dilemmas of Western Marxism. Since the movements of the economic base did not of themselves produce a revolutionary class consciousness, the issue of consciousness needed to be addressed, though without retreating to the idealism of Kant, Hegel, and Croce. Could this be done within a Marxist framework, or did the Leninist model have to be somehow suited to Western realities? Since adoption of Leninism seemed increasingly implausible in the 1920s, and even more so after World War II, Western Marxists such as Sartre asked, could Marxism be tempered by incorporating insights from other bodies of thought, such as idealism, psychoanalysis, or existentialism? Gramsci's analysis of the so-called Southern question in 1926 leads him to the conclusion that if politics always lags behind economics, it can be said that the time of the base is different from the time of the superstructure. Moreover, in terms of economic development and expansion of the material forces of production, time is different in the states of the capitalist core, such as England and France, and in the states of the capitalist periphery, such as Spain, Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, with Italy and Germany occupying a somewhat contradictory location in between. To complicate the Italian situation even more, the divide between the rapidly industrializing North and the semi-feudal agrarian South meant that differential time across national frontiers had to be balanced by the consideration that time within national boundaries could also differ. The victory and consolidation of fascism in the years 1922 to 1925 compelled Gramsci to reread Marx's 18th Brumaire in the light of the specificities of southern Italian underdevelopment, and to see how in peripheral states the battle for the allegiance of intermediate social strata assumes immense significance in the working class struggle for hegemony. In Prison, Gramsci seeks to formulate an alternative to Bernstein's reformism, which was likely to lead to social democracy, and Lenin's voluntarism, which was inappropriate for the conditions of Europe. What was needed was the full elaboration of a Marxist theory of politics, which the first theorist of historical materialism never managed to write. The prison notebooks are written with the lessons of the failures of 1919 to 20 in mind. One lesson is that the emphasis on councils and other institutions rooted in the world of labor is correct and remains valid from a Marxist standpoint. Against the syndicalist notion of the necessity of proletarian autonomy, however, the emphasis on factory organization would have to be combined with a political engagement with all of society. It becomes clear to Gramsci that seeking refuge in economic determinism or ideological purity allows the political representatives of capital and political reaction to reorganize the relations between capital and labor on their own terms and through passive revolutions. This means that political initiatives from key figures and institutions within the superstructure to overhaul the base are every bit as important as developments within the base itself, if not more so. If there is no direct or immediately causal relation between economic crisis and consciousness and revolution, all the appropriate political conditions for revolutionary transformation have to be created autonomously from a variety of directions and a variety of ways. In the context of Italian post-unification and beyond, this means that, quote, winning the battle of democracy, end quote, as highlighted by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, entails an ideological and cultural battle on several fronts at once. While it is a battle at the level of the base, it is also a battle at the level of the superstructure. Within the superstructure itself, however, Gramsci distinguishes between institutions of direct repression, such as the army, police, intelligence forces, and distinct instances of the executive generally on the one hand, and institutions of hegemony, such as the church, universities, schools, press, and media on the other. He refers to the sphere of direct repression of political society and the institutions of hegemony as civil society. Here, the issue of winning the battle of democracy, raised in Chapter 1, finally achieves concrete expression. It means engaging in a successful campaign to transform common sense and traditional modes of thinking in civil society that maintain the political and temporal gulf between economic crisis and political revolution. In this formulation, sorry. In this formulation, the state is not a mere executive of the entire bourgeoisie. Indeed, the implication is that it is not appropriate to speak in terms of the state or superstructure in monolithic terms at all. The state, like capital, is understood in terms of a network of relations which are to be transformed rather than seized or occupied. In Gramsci's estimation, the key role in this process of resistance and change is played by intellectuals. Once again, he makes a distinction that marks an original contribution to Western Marxism. He distinguishes between traditional intellectuals from various backgrounds who establish their status by promoting the idea of the intellectual as a member of a free-floating caste operating above the arena of social struggle, and organic intellectuals from the subaltern milieu who politically remain committed to the groups and classes they come from. While traditional intellectuals, such as Croce in the Italian case, protect their own interests as a caste at the same time as serving the existing order, organic intellectuals are in a position to challenge the existing order because of their organic relation with the masses. Hence, Gramsci argues that in Italy, organic intellectuals like himself must articulate a working class, though not nearly sectarian as in the 1919 to 1920 standpoint, in order to 1. Win the allegiance of traditional intellectuals and make them see that liberal democracy and capitalism were English institutions imported by a feeble Italian bourgeoisie and are inappropriate to Italian realities, and 2. Win the peasantry to the cause of communism as the solution to the question of what new institution should be adopted. Gramsci argues further that the southern peasantry of the day remained under the influence of large land-owning interests because of the enduring influence of intellectuals who did nothing to discourage the deeply anchored belief that existing social relations are somehow natural. They indirectly encouraged deference to the church and local bureaucracy when they should have been fostering critical engagement with the abuse of public authority. In the prison writings, Gramsci reserves especially harsh criticism for Croce and other intellectuals who he believes had a hand in separating the radical southern intelligentsia from the peasants by encouraging them to adopt superficially cosmopolitan attitudes while neglecting local conditions. Intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, such as local government officials, journalists, lawyers, and academics, play a key role in keeping together what Gramsci refers to as the, quote, historic bloc, end quote, of southern landowners and northern industrial capital, which ran the country outside and against Parliament, and the little that existed in the way of democratic control in the Italy of G.D.H and in the more obvious ways of Mussolini. The Italian Revolution would thus depend on the ability of the Communist Party and workers' councils to disaggregate the bloc of southern landowners and northern industrialists in order for the peasants to organize independently of these forces. This cultural process of disaggregation could not be accomplished without the help of intellectuals like Gaetano Salvemini, Piero Gabetti, and Guido Dorso, who had championed the cause of the South. Gramsci insists throughout the prison notebooks that in order to avoid a successful assault on state power followed by leadership struggles and political indecision, the revolution was to be carefully prepared before the actual seizure of power, if this is even necessary, in what he calls a war of position. The implications clearly go well beyond the Italian context within which Gramsci formulates his ideas. By the time of the prison writings, Gramsci realizes that if he wants to understand the networks of power in any society, one must never fetishize or reify the ostensibly crucial role of parliaments and constitutions. One must look instead of how a constellation of class and ideological alliances are simultaneously pursued as political strategies at the levels of the economy, civil society, and political society. Strategy in this case refers not only to the secure control of the economy, it refers to a much wider conception of leadership implied by the terms hegemony and common sense. Long before Michel Foucault's seminal theoretical and historical research on power undertaken beyond the parameters of Marxism, it is clear to Gramsci that power circulates in protean and capillary networks that ignore the methodological distinctions between civil society and state or base and superstructure. At this stage of the discussion on Gramsci, the usage of the term hegemony is coming more sharply into focus. The former, quote, peoples, end quote, democracies, end quote, At this stage of the discussion on Gramsci, the usage of the term hegemony is coming more sharply into focus. The former, quote, people's democracies, end quote, in Eastern Europe supply a clear example of what hegemony is not. The necessity to resort to heavy policing and extensive propaganda is a sure indication that hegemony is absent or breaking down. Thus, the necessity of the USSR and Warsaw Pact to use force in 1953 in East Germany, 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and 1981 in Poland suggests that the communist parties of the different Eastern Bloc countries had come to power with the help of the advancing Red Army. Although this assured that ascent to power, they were not culturally or politically prepared to transform common sense and the experience of everyday life. Hence, hegemony means something distinct from coercion or authoritarian rule. Marx and Engels anticipate Gramsci's theory of hegemony to a certain extent in the German ideology from 1845, where they say that ruling class ideas are in every epoch the ruling ideas. But in Gramsci's formulation, hegemony does not denote simple ideological mystification or fetishizing in the sense that Feuerbach or the young Marx might speak of fetishism or reification. There is a distinctively Machiavellian lineage to the concept insofar as Machiavelli argues that whether or not a new prince is able to stay in power turns fundamentally on how the prince got there in the first place. In a manner analogous to the Italian Risorgimento, where French aid and Austrian demise were more important for independence than a mass movement for unity, the regimes in Eastern Europe came to power on the strength of the Soviet army and the defeat of German National Socialism. In Machiavellian Gramscian terms, this can be regarded as an excessive reliance on luck, fortuna, and a conspicuous failure to construct anew the socio-economic, cultural, and political bases of a new hegemony, hegemonia. A non-hegemonic elite will generally attempt to shore up its control of the economy by authoritarian means, as in the case of the Risorgimento, or with repression and terror, as in the case of fascism. These are examples of attempts to increase the scope of direct state intervention in the economy. There are also instances where changes in economy necessitate a rolling back of direct state intervention for the purpose of introducing more flexible labor market structures, as Gramsci illustrates in the notebook Americanism and Fordism. With remarkable prescience, he speculates on the consequence of increasingly sophisticated techniques of domination and surveillance in the workplace, and how these could lead to a reshuffling in the historic block of forces that rule a country at any point in time. He notes that the transition from craft production to industrial production to assembly line production has effects on consumption culture and even physical appearances. Gramsci thus anticipates Pier Paolo Pasolini, who lived from 1922 to 1975's observation that one could walk into an Italian piazza in the 1950s and accurately predict the social origins of a person simply by looking at their face and body. At this stage in the development of post-war capitalism, different social classes displaying conspicuously distinct physiological traits and cultural mannerisms. If one goes back into the same piazza in the 1970s in the aftermath of the so-called, quote, economic miracle, end quote, Pasolini maintains, one is struck by the large-scale disappearance of these differences. In terms of the passive revolution required to establish the cultural and economic transition to a consumer goods-oriented economy based on low production cost and systematic de-skilling of the workforce, however, the incorrect conclusion to be drawn from this hegemonization process is that society has become more democratic. Instead, the power that the observer could once literally read from faces and bodies has shifted to other sites of struggle. Power is no longer metaphorically transparent to physical typologies, and hegemony is no longer a function of these kinds of differences. Stated in more contemporary terms, the quote, traditional end quote, working class might well become less visible due to structural and superstructural changes. In the case of the gradual influx of migrant workers and young women into the workforce, the new sites of struggle attain variegated levels of social visibility. Gramsci's prison notebooks clearly indicate the extent to which Marx's ideas need updating, as well as the tremendous suppleness of Marxism and its capacity to assimilate new ideas and expand in different directions. Developing the concept of hegemony, historic bloc, passive revolution, civil society, and political society, Gramsci provides Marxism with a theory of politics and a new theory of superstructures. His ideas on common sense and hegemony provide the bases of an incipient Marxist theory of culture and form the general background for a number of debates within Western Marxism on culture and revolutionary politics to be explored below. I'm running late, gotta get going. The problem of the superstructure reconsidered. 2. Korsch and Lukács. If Gramsci's lasting contribution to the left in Europe is to have substantially enriched historical materialism with a theory of politics as well as a new base and superstructure model, it is Georg Lukács' achievement to have solidified the bases of Marxist epistemology. Hence, along with the prison notebooks, Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, figures among the most important theoretical works of Western Marxism. Lukács deepens and develops a number of themes that appear for the first time in Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, which is another important text published in 1923. Marxism and Philosophy takes up where Korsch left off in Industrial Law for Workers' Councils of the previous year. Much like Korsch's earlier essay, What is Socialization?, published in 1919, Industrial Law of Workers' Councils echoes Gramsci's assessment of the radically democratic structure of the council during the Italian Biennio Rosso of 1919-20. Korsch's political convictions are underpinned by a juridical and philosophical interest in the potentially revolutionary implications of a form of legal universality that is authorized to dissolve the power differential between classes by abolishing private property and control over the production process as the private right of capital. In the aftermath of World War I and into the early 1920s, Korsch and Gramsci are convinced that the factory council is an ideal institution combining proximity to the work process offered by the trade union with decision-making capacities nominally associated with the political party. Hence, both thinkers are also associated with the decidedly anti-Leninist implications of council communism. That's not true. Or maybe it's not true, but that's a strong statement. In my opinion, sorry. In different ways, they share the conviction that the Marxist critique of capitalism is deficient if unaccompanied by an outline of an alternative economy Oh, you start talking about Lukács, talking about Korsch and Gramsci. Okay. Maybe that's a little less controversial, but still kind of controversial because if you've listened to the other piece that I've did an audiobook for of what the hell is his name? Douglas Kellner's extended essay on the political development of Karl Korsch's thinking. He basically says that Korsch is a more or less conventional Leninist for much of the 1920s until he was he was a member in the Reichstag of the KPD. So pretty convinced Leninist for a number of years before coming to counsel communist positions. Anyway, hence both thinkers are also associated with the decidedly anti-Leninist implications of council communism. In different ways, also Gramsci was pretty instrumental in the Bolshevization of the Italian Communist Party. Anyway, in different ways, They share the conviction that the Marxist critique of capitalism is deficient if unaccompanied by an outline of an alternative economy through which working humanity collectively controls the mediation processes structuring its relation with nature. The implication is that an economic system in which this control is usurped by a combination of socialist planners and a single political party within the framework of a so-called, quote, workers' state, end quote, is as unacceptable as a system based on private appropriation and accumulation. If the prerogatives of capital are assumed by a new historic block of apparatchiks and central planners, the revolution could be considered lost. Korsch, Gramsci, and Lukács were all directly involved in the experiments in council democracy that swept Central Europe and Italy in 1919-20. 1 week after its formation in 1918, Lukács joined the Hungarian Communist Party. He served as a commissar for public education in Bela Kun's coalition government until it was overthrown by right-wing forces in the summer of 1919. Lukács then fled to Vienna, where he began developing his ideas on Marxist epistemology and communist aesthetics. After the collapse of the factory occupations and the founding of the Communist Party of Italy, Gramsci worked in Vienna and Moscow before being sentenced to jail. Korsch quickly fell foul of communist orthodoxy by refusing to moderate his demands for worker as opposed to party control of the revolution. Following the defeat of council democracy in Italy, Berlin, Munich, and Budapest, and the twin processes of capitalist reconsolidation in the 1920s and the rise of Stalin in Russia, all three thinkers were compelled to address the necessity of rethinking the bases of Marxist theory and practice. It has been seen how Gramsci attempts to provide Marx with a theory of politics. It remains to be seen how Korsch and especially Lukács attempt to develop a Marxist epistemology appropriate for the realities of the 20th century. The turn-of-the-century crisis of Marxism that forms the background to Labriola's and then Gramsci's ideas in Italy is a general phenomenon with consequences for the left all across Europe and informing the work of Korsch and Lukács. What perhaps seemed like a minor dispute between Sorel, Crozet, Bernstein, and Labriola assumes great importance with the outbreak of World War I and then with the consolidation of Western European capitalism against the challenges of the Russian Revolution and the short-lived council republics. Many of the most incisive commentators on Western Marxism, such as Anderson, Jay, and Jameson, note that the isolation of the USSR and the insufficiently revolutionary consciousness of the Western European working classes and peasantry quite clearly threatened to turn communism into the official regime ideology of the USSR rather than the dialectical theory of knowledge and action that it is for Marx. It is against this background that Korsch writes Marxism and philosophy. He distinguishes between three discernible periods in Marxist theory and practice. The first is in 1843 to 8, the phase from on the Jewish question of 1843 to the Communist Manifesto of 1848. In a second phase dating from 1848 to 1900, the young Marx died in 1883. Marxist theory, okay. The second phase, from 1848 to 1900, the young Marx's stress on the totality constituted by humanity, nature, and their mediation starts to give way to the separation of Marxist economics from Marxist politics and the dispersion of historical materialist inquiry into the fields of sociology, ideology, and culture. The suggestion is that although this tendency is most pronounced in positivist interpretations of historical materialism that appeared from the death of its founders, Marx and Engels, nonetheless helped promote it to the extent that they stressed the need to make philosophical inquiry superfluous by realizing philosophy in practice. Korsch then warns of the dangers arising from 1900 onwards. Korsch maintains that in this stage, many Marxists abandon the ideas of dialectics and totality. The consequence is that the movement bifurcated into positivist science and voluntarist politics. Korsch argues that Marxists must address the problem of Second International Marxism and the inability of the council system to establish itself as an alternative to the bourgeois parliamentary state. The key to this project entails a careful reevaluation of Hegel and the philosophical basis of Marxism. It is much to his credit that he urges this epistemological taking stock 9 years before Marx's 1844 manuscripts were published for the first time in Moscow in 1932. To a number of Western Marxist and critical theorists, these fragmentary notes reveal the young Marx to be first and foremost a dialectician probing the philosophical and synthetic dimensions of reality rather than a scientist in search of the empirical bases of materialism. In Vienna in the early 1920s, Lukács came to a similar understanding of the proper relation between Hegel and Marx in the eight essays collected in History and Class Consciousness. The bureaucratic leadership of the Third International had little time for the advocates of a qualified return to Hegel or a reinvigoration of the role of subjectivity and consciousness in left politics. Korsch was expelled from the German Communist Party in 1926, and Lukács was bullied into renouncing the views expressed in History and Class Consciousness. Yet for both thinkers, the issue is not primarily about the unequivocal primacy of mind or matter, since this would constitute a regression to pre-Kantian philosophy. The issue is more centrally concerned with the dialectical relationship between humanity and nature and their mediation in history, that is, with the overcoming of the static dichotomies that characterize reified modes of thinking. This idea is first developed by Hegel in his critique of Kant and then given a Marxist framework by Lukács in History and Class Consciousness. In order to fully understand this central text of Western Marxism, it is first necessary to say a few words about Lukács' ideas prior to 1923. In addition to the epistemological ideas of Kant and especially Hegel, the sociology of Georg Simmel, who lived from 1858 to 1918, and Max Weber, who lived from 1864 to 1920, and the existentialism of Kierkegaard, who lived from 1813 to 1855, and Dostoevsky, who lived from 1821 to 81, form the cultural background to the Hungarian philosopher's early development. Lukács left Budapest in 1906 to study in Berlin, where he attended Simmel's lectures, and then moved to Heidelberg in 1912, where he became friends with Weber and Ernst Bloch, who lived from 1885 to 1977, the author of The Principle of Hope, written in American exile during 1938 to 1947 and published in the mid-1950s. At the risk of simplification, one can say that what one reads in History and Class Consciousness is a remarkable synthesis of Hegel on dialectics and totality, Kierkegaard and Simmel on the inevitable discrepancy between individual life and social forms, institutions, Weber on the rise and spread of instrumental reason, and Marx on reification and the political mission of the proletariat. And as indicated above, Lukács is not a political cadre determined to invent epistemological positions that match the party line at any given time. Lukács is a political philosopher and aesthetician whose main aim is to demonstrate how it is possible to move beyond the individualist premises of liberalism and the antinomies of bourgeois thought and life, theory/practice, private/public, individual/state, etc. He attempts to formulate a radicalization of Hegelian idealism that also eschews the mechanical and positivist materialism of Second International Marxism. It is thus unsurprising that a number of idealist and existentialist motifs about the structure of experience, the limits of knowledge, and the conditions of action inform his entire oeuvre. Oh man, his entire work. Oeuvre. Christ on the cross, despite his continually professed adherence to the principles of Marxist-Leninist materialism and literary realism. In the essays written between 1907 and 1910, contained in Soul and Form, published in 1911, Lukács ponders the chaos of life. He sees a conflict between the necessity of giving form to the chaos for the purposes of making knowledge of life and reality possible on the one hand, and the danger of stifling living vitality and distorting reality in the very process of form-giving and on the other. In terms highly reminiscent of Nietzsche and Simmel, Lukács suggests that there can be no knowledge or content without form, yet impoverished form will tend to increase the distance between knowing subjects and the objects of cognition. In The Theory of the Novel, published in 1916, Lukács gives these ideas a historical foundation by arguing that epistemological form is a function of society and history rather than a static or transcendental aesthetic concept. In what clearly must have had an impact on Adorno's negative dialectics and aesthetic theory, in 1916, Lukács suggests that at the core of the coming utopianism is a creative impulse propelled by the desire for the discovery of aesthetic and philosophical form that strives to be form, knowledge, theory, and content, life, practice, as at one and the same time. Another way of saying this in more Hegelian terms is that the right form overcomes the dichotomy between form and content. A surplus of quantity eventually results in an increase in quality. In the theory of the novel, Lukács distinguishes between the era of the Homeric epic, the period of transition between incipient modernity in the work of Dante, who lived from 1265 to 1321, the bourgeois novel, and the intimations of a post-bourgeois literature in the writings of Dostoevsky. Whereas the conflict between form and life is hardly present in Greek art and society, it becomes flagrant by the time of the bourgeois novel and the appearance of bourgeois interiority. Indeed, throughout his life, Lukács remains committed to the idea that the retreat to the inner sanctum of the self he sees in experimental and avant-garde writing is symptomatic of the divorce of life and objective reality from aesthetic form and subjective consciousness. When life is imprisoned by form, knowledge of life is mystified. The result is that freedom is thwarted by fearful withdrawal. He remains steadfast in his conviction, no matter how stylistically innovative and ostensibly revolutionary in certain aspects of literary and artistic modernism, bourgeois interiority is basically defeatist, if not outright reactionary. One glimpses the profundity of Lukács' contribution to Western Marxism by considering the dilemma with which he is confronted. From the foregoing discussion, it is clear that the conflict between life and form has a counterpart in Marx's distinction between the base and superstructure. Because of his knowledge of Nietzsche, Simmel, and Weber, Lukács is acutely aware that any conflation between life and base is likely to result in epistemological reductionism and political putschism. Yet because of his understanding of Hegel and Marx, he is equally cognizant of the fact that any rigid separation between life and base is likely to give rise to all manner of theories in nationalist and irrational anti-Marxist existentialist and religious movements. It is clear to him that the choice between unequivocal allegiance to the Communist Party, conflation between life and base, or the Academy, rigid separation between life and base, is admittedly a false choice. Faced with the reality of the 1917 revolution in the East and not in England as Marx had predicted, it is nonetheless a choice with which Lukács is forced to struggle. He opts for Hegel, Marx totality, and dialectics against Nietzsche, Weber, Simmel, existentialism, and ontology. Key thinkers on the European left after World War II attempt to work out syntheses instead of choosing sides in this debate. Sartre is one such figure, as will be shown below. For now, it is safe to say that for the left, it is impossible to overestimate the stakes involved in this endeavor to ascertain the correct relationship between life/form, base/superstructure, and Marxism/existentialism. If these phenomena cannot be mediated successfully, there exists the possibility of a highly depoliticizing celebration of the inevitable difference between theory and practice. This, in its turn, could lead to the academic isolation of theory and the proliferation of disoriented and largely futile activism. Given that a cursory glance at the left in Europe today suggests that this might be an accurate depiction of the current political situation, it will be useful to return to the issue and the conclusion of this book. In the period following the publication of the theory of the novel and culminating in the publication of History and Class Consciousness, Lukács comes to see that the epistemological project of revolutionizing thought in the name of knowledge is inseparably bound up with the project of revolutionizing reality in the name of freedom. He concludes that only revolutionized thought and reality can guarantee a form of political freedom that can redeem the radical implications suggested by the idea that real freedom, not simply freedom to sell one's labor power to express one's opinion in largely symbolic ways, is freedom from necessity. Freedom from necessity demands social and political institutions that liberate all of humanity, not merely a single class, from forms of labor mediating between humanity and nature that reproduce heteronomy and necessity. In advanced capitalist economies, Lukács argues, heteronomy and necessity assume an institutional profile in social phenomena such as commodity production, a rigid division of mental and manual labor, and control over the conditions of production by non-producers interested in profit rather than the satisfaction of needs and creativity. Hence, freedom from necessity demands revolution. The first step in this conquest of freedom is revolutionizing thought by transcending the bourgeois cultural horizon, rather than simply dismissing bourgeois thought and life in favor of irrational vitality, to a naive return to primitive spontaneity or pseudo-scientific materialism. To achieve this rational transcendence, it is necessary to expose the contradictions in the work of the best thinkers of middle-class culture, such as Kant, Hegel, and Simmel. Kant and Simmel stand above idiosyncratic and anecdotal forms of spurious objectivity by systematically demonstrating that all objectivity is mediated by subjectivity. From the moment it is recognized that there is a subjective dimension to objective knowledge, it is possible to see that it is entirely possible for subjects to create the world in which they live in a non-arbitrary, i.e. truthful way. On this account, freedom to know the objective world is bound up with freedom to create the socio-economic and political conditions that make objective knowledge itself possible. Two closely related consequences derive from this analysis. First, knowledge of the objective world cannot exist without a knowing subject that knows the world without the constraints of necessity. Lest knowledge be confused with something more akin to religion, superstition, myth, or some other desperate response to the evident reality that nature does not automatically provide the remedies of necessity. Second, the only knowing subject capable of abolishing these constraints is a collective subject that creates the conditions of objectivity freed from necessity, since it is the collective labor of humanity on nature that remedies the fact that nature is not spontaneously generous with nature's fruits, and that all hitherto existing forms of society and modes of production have been painfully unsuccessful at overcoming necessity for the vast majority of its members. In the proletariat and communism, Lukács sees the emancipatory synthesis of epistemological form and socio-political content. What distinguishes advanced industrial capitalism as a social form and a mode of production is that, for the first time in history, the economy ceases to be a marginal activity performed for the sake of more important purposes such as political authority and religious ritual. Lukács is deeply influenced by Weber's thesis that the rise of specifically ascetic forms of Protestantism indicates that the economy has penetrated all spheres of existence, including spiritual life. The Protestant is calculating about the possibility of salvation and throws himself into work in the hope of receiving some kind of sign from God without the intermediary of the church hierarchy. Combining the insights of Weber on Protestantism and the young Marx on commodity production, Lukács arrives at the conclusion that the long-term consequence of the penetration of the economy into all spheres of life is the transformation of reason from a dialectical mediating instance in Kant and Hegel into a tool divorced from any recognizable ethical or political ends. In a gradual but inexorable process of reification, quote, the economy, end quote, acquires its own dynamic and laws which confront individual actors as something natural and against which they are powerless to do anything autonomous. This situation is fundamentally ambiguous. On the one hand, capitalism creates unprecedented levels of economic development which make freedom from necessity an objective possibility rather than wishful thinking. In this sense, capitalism furnishes all the elements necessary for a devastating critique of capitalism. On the other hand, the reification and alienation that accompany the growth process threaten to blind its potential opponents to the workings of the system. A number of critical theorists examined in the next chapter suggest that reification and alienation incapacitate and integrate the working class to such an extent that a proletarian revolution in the Marxist sense may no longer be possible. By contrast, in 1923, Lukács is confident that the permeation of economic rationality into all the pores of society creates a class of people who are educated and highly politicized by the fact that their entire being is invested by commodity production and consumption. The very existence of this class marks the beginning of the end of antinomies such as is, ought, and theory/practice. The proletariat is quite simply the negation of capitalist society and the alphabung of the discrepancy between equality of citizenship and the manifest inequality between classes. The unresolved tension in Lukács' history and class consciousness resides in his declaration at the end of chapter 4 that communism will be constructed when the collective subjectivity of the workers is moved to action by an awareness of the objective possibilities offered by the mere fact of their de facto communist Dasein, of their revolutionary being, and the fact that they are both subject and object of the historical process in advanced capitalist societies. He then equivocates by saying that the Communist Party has a fundamental role in galvanizing that process, since workers in capitalism suffer from alienation and reified consciousness. Lukács stresses consciousness and advocates council democracy, yet he was also prepared to accept the realities of single-party rule in the USSR and the Soviet bloc after World War II. The dilemma between the objective reality of class structure and the facticity of existential choice of political allegiance fueled the imagination of Jean-Paul Sartre, who lived from 1905 to 1980, who highlights the contradictions between life, economy, and form, superstructure, in terms of the precedence of existence over essence. Existentialist commitment and structuralist epistemology, Sartre and Althusser. Sartre attempts to project beyond the limitations of Lukács's position. It has been seen that the latter is somewhat caught between the epistemological imperative not to reduce the complexity of life to class relations and the struggle for survival, on the one hand, and the political imperative to take collective control of life by impressing a communist form on the labor process on the other. The logic of this argument drives Lukács to the conclusion that where the proletariat appears to be unable to build communism spontaneously through a network of democratic councils, the democratic centralist Communist Party must assume the lead role in the process. Sartre acknowledges the dilemma of choosing between philosophical rigor in epistemological questions and adopting discipline in political questions, as well as the more general dilemma between the spontaneity of life and the distorting constraints placed on spontaneous life by epistemological form. Marx, Gramsci, and Lukács are confident that the liberation of the struggle for survival from class relations and wage labor will transform the labor process into a means of actively creating reality as well as accurately knowing reality. By contrast, Sartre believes that humanity is not only alienated from its labor power because of the private appropriation of socially produced wealth. For Sartre, humanity is also alienated from being, and being can never be simply reappropriated for ontological reasons that exceed the scope of human action. Although humanity makes contact with being in consciousness and all forms of action, not just labor, there is always a discrepancy between pure being, quote, in itself, end quote, and human being, quote, for itself, end quote. The quote, for itself, end quote, he suggests in his early works yearns for union with the pure being implied by being, quote, in itself, end quote. Although it can never fully attain this union, humanity is condemned to try to attain it, and it is condemned to freedom and ultimately failure. In terms starkly reminiscent of Heidegger's notion of the Geworfenheit, the human condition of being thrown into the world, the author of Being and Nothingness, published in 1943, and the Critique of Dialectical Reason, published in 1960, argue that the conflict between philosophical rigor and political coherence must be tested in a series of projects, or what he also refers to as engaged situations of commitment and responsibility. It also means that the tension between life and form is resolved in the concrete reality of existence. And the latter, he adds in a much celebrated phrase, precedes essence. Sartre holds that although in subjective terms the individual is condemned to freedom, Marxism nonetheless constitutes the, quote, unsurpassable horizon of our time, end quote. That is the most accurate measure of objective reality as long as capitalism decisively structures forms of consciousness and sets the terms of socially imposed necessity. To say that necessity is socially imposed is to argue that in modern societies it is not nature that imposes scarcity on humanity. It is the bourgeois ruling class that dominates other classes by imposing its institutions and values while excluding other possible ways of life. The more capitalism breaks the bounds of a definable economic sphere and begins to embrace all areas of life, the more those other possible ways of living are frustrated, thus necessitating a creative political response on economic, political, ethical, and aesthetic levels. This situation is complicated by the fact that there are bourgeois liberals, bourgeois communists, proletarian fascists, proletarian liberals, as well as depoliticized bourgeoisie and proletarians. People choose their commitments in ways that confirm but also conflict with their social origins. The corollary is that each person, regardless of the milieu they stem from, is capable of overcoming the horizons of that milieu. For Sartre, even if Marxism is indispensable for an understanding of our times, Marxism's orthodox formulations are badly mistaken in reducing consciousness and political commitments to location in the class structure. Like Gramsci, Sartre is opposed to any mechanical understanding of the relation between economic objectivity and subjective consciousness. To a greater extent than Gramsci and especially Lukács, however, Sartre is prepared to accept the implications of human freedom and the open-ended character of the historical process. For the latter, it is clear that Marxism desperately needs a theory of action that does not reduce motivation to class location. It also needs a theory of existence that acknowledges the incommensurability of consciousness and being. That incommensurability will always place the subject at some distance from the object, such that there can be no subject-object of history. A close inspection of the history suggests that what one witnesses is not the Hegelian Lukácsian tendency towards subject-object totality. History is not simply a class struggle, but rather the struggle of conflicting groups to totalize subject-object relations in order to bring about their conception of the greatest possible humanization of being. The greatest possible humanization of being. On this account, Marxism explains why the proletariat could potentially realize an unprecedented humanization of being, but by ignoring individual human freedom and the responsibility to choose, the Communist Party of France and other communist parties were turning their backs on Marx. Hence, Marxism needed to be enriched and updated with existentialism. He explains why in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which the Prison Notebooks and History of Class Consciousness is the third of the three key texts of Western Marxism considered in this chapter. 1 second. The fact that political allegiances cannot simply be deduced from class location is just one of the consequences of the divergence between the ontological quote in itself and the anthropological quote for itself. Like Heidegger, Sartre does not start from the assumption that epistemology rests on an unshakable human foundation such as consciousness, as expressed, for example, by Descartes' quote, "I think, therefore I am," end quote, or Kant's transcendental ego. Heidegger proceeds from the non-foundational reality of collective Dasein and Geworfenheit, i.e. from the view that the world, both internal to and external to the individual that he/she shares with other individuals, is already there when each person is born. What humanity knows about the world is revealed to humanity by being in a process in which humanity actively participates, quote, for itself, end quote, but does not own or totally control, because being, quote, in itself, end quote, is not an attribute of humanity. For both thinkers, the world is an ongoing and plural event into which the individual is thrown and in which they are forced to answer fundamental questions about their relation to being. For Heidegger, these questions include, will I ignore the existence of being and forget that being has its own history that shapes my life on earth, Or will I, quote, allow being to be, end quote, so to speak, so that it can reveal itself to me in all of its otherness? For Sartre, it is not so much a question of the patience of letting be or attempting to manipulate being. In the introductory Search for a Method section of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre explains that there is a standoff between Hegel on the objectivity of history and Kierkegaard on the subjectivity of existence that can only be resolved by Marxism. He remarks that Hegel is correct to speak of objective spirit in institutions and the fact that all subjectivity is constituted by socio-political and historical objectivity. Insofar it is true to affirm in Hegelian manner that the totality of subjectivity and objectivity is nothing other than reason operative in history. Yet Kierkegaard is also right to emphasize that the totality is fractured by particularity and that rational history is interrupted by passion and faith in ways that are not immediately recognizable with Hegelian notions of totality and reason, not without scoffing at human suffering at any rate. Marxism represents the unsurpassable horizon of our time for Sartre because Marxism unites what is true in Hegel and Kierkegaard by furnishing the bases of a method of research about the modalities of being and the conditions of freedom. Whereas the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had long since transformed Marxism in Russia from a method into a dogma and a series of irrefutable truths, Marx's writings continue to offer the soundest method for exploring existence as a concrete totalization of subjective desires, objective needs, and material objects and forces. That is to say that in terms of explaining the mediation of humanity and nature in the institutional structuralism of the labor process, Marx is a constant reminder that freedom remains in large measure ideological until freedom is organized freedom from necessity for all of society. But Sartre adds that an overemphasis on labor in the process of satisfying material scarcity and need will lead to an ignorance of the fact that people need intimacy and solidarity with some of their fellows whilst needing distance and separation from others. Anticipating the critical sociology of Pierre Bourdieu, who lived from 1930 to 2002, Sartre intimates that people grow up in the habitus of socioeconomic classes where their economic needs are met in vastly varying degrees, but they also grow up in families, groups, and neighborhoods where their intellectual and emotional needs for recognition and community are also differentially satisfied. Just as social class can be an advantage or an impediment to the transcendence of necessity, so too can the family, the couple, the city, and even the nation be a positive force or a hindrance. Sartre quips that reading the theorists of the Communist Party of France gives one the impression that they were born into the condition of wage labor as adults with no past life as children and youths. This is to ignore the fact that it is one thing to buy or sell one's labor while simultaneously having a positive attitude toward love and friendship, as well as a critical view of all forms of authority. It is quite another to buy or sell one's labor power and at the same time be continually frustrated in one's attempts to engage in meaningful relations with others and to crave forms of authority that satisfy deep-seated needs for emotional security. Since bourgeois and Soviet forms of society are eminently capable of producing both kinds of individual, there is far more to bourgeois and Bolshevik rule than a given system of production. One can say that the reason why one is continually frustrated in one's attempts to engage in meaningful relations with others and why one craves authority is that one has been made that way by nature or manipulated in that direction by the realities of social class. The tendency to explain individual lack of freedom in this way is to indulge in what Sartre refers to as, quote, bad faith, end quote, in his early writings and especially in Being and Nothingness. In Sartre's subsequent evolution towards the existentialist Marxism of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre develops an original analysis of mediations which substantially departs from the typical macro-Marxist themes of humanity/nature or base/superstructure. He concentrates instead on the formulation of a micro-Marxist analysis of personalities, situations, and group dynamics. To do this, he invents a range of concepts, including the practico-inert, the regressive progressive method, seriality, and the materiality of concepts and language. Sartre's aim in this invention will be briefly summarized below. Sartre intentionally discards the Hegelian Marxist idea of totality and the corresponding notions of reified consciousness, exploitation/reappropriation, and the laws of history. Sartre thinks that for all its claims of being materialist, the Hegelian Marxism of thinkers like Lukács remains wedded to the idealist notion that the essence of humanity consists in its capacity to transform nature through labor power, and that the revolution achieves the reappropriation of that expropriated essence. This is incompatible with the claim that existence precedes essence. Moreover, he adds, it is this understanding that compels Lukács and others to explain the lack of revolutionary consciousness amongst the workers in terms of reified consciousness, which mistakes relations between things for relations between people and false consciousness, which is simply another way of saying that they do not think like the party leadership. Instead of enriching Marxism with a credible theory of social action, the consequence of this mode of explanation is to entrust the party with the task of leading the revolution. At one level, this produces the cult of the leader within the party hierarchy and the reduction of the individual member to a function of the group. At another level, it absolves the party of having to transform the relations constituting the world or engaging in political projects to create a new world. It is passively assumed that the laws of history will sort themselves out and reschedule the revolution. For Sartre, it is misleading to say that the working class suffers from reified or false consciousness and fails to see its alienated essence in the products of the capitalist labor process. It is true that commodity production introduces a palpable element of opacity into social relations, but the relationship between the working class and the products the working class manufactures and services it manufactures and services it provides is one of interiority as well as exteriority, mediated by concepts, words, and particular experiences that vary from person to person. To some extent, the workers recognize their labor power in the material they produce, and to some extent they do not. Some become politicized and others are happy with private pleasures. Just as there are no laws of history, there are no general laws of consciousness and organization. On Sartre's account, resistance against the deadness of the labored material, which he calls the pratico-inert, takes shape when groups come into being as a result of the sense of commitment and responsibility of concrete individuals. Group action is so varied that it cannot be assimilated under the single category of class. Strikes, occupations, absenteeism, defiance of official ideology on questions of race and colonialism, and disrespect for traditional gender relations are all instances of the ways different groups respond to the modes in which the living energy of labor power and dissent become frozen in the inertia of objects, institutions, and monuments, instead of a monolithic class of workers who, with reified or false consciousness, Sartre observes a network of groups that coalesce, disperse, and reform on new bases across a wide field of social conflict marked by congruent, overlapping, and contrasting allegiances. It has been observed that in many ways this analysis is much more appropriate for the modes of struggle associated with the May events in Paris in 1968 than mechanical versions of historical materialism or Soviet versions of Marxism-Leninism. In this context, 1968 stands for a revolutionary critique of the existing order, which includes established political parties like the Communist Party of France. Then it can indeed be said that Sartre offers the basis of a non-orthodox left-wing politics with contemporary relevance. Using what Sartre calls the regressive progressive method, he attempts to show that individuals and groups understand the sense of their political projects by mentally returning to their point of departure before action, rather than appealing to the inexorable forward march of history. After this regression and taking stock is accomplished, it is possible to progress to new projects and new commitments. Sartre rejects the notion of linear time governed by the idea that we all have a certain number of time units that are gradually running out like sand in an hourglass. If time had this structure and the meaning of life consisted in preserving one's units for as long as possible, we would be compelled to accept the liberal idea that freedom is largely a matter of non-infringement and non-interference in the affairs of others. He also rejects the messianic concept of time adopted in different ways by orthodox Marxism, according to which the injustices of earthly existence will eventually be redeemed in a revolution, so that the workers need only wait for the great day. He sees history instead as regressive, progressive, serial, and marked by the intersection of past and present that defines linearity and messianism. The ideas of the practico-inert and seriality are closely connected. We have seen in this book that for Kant, all objectivity is mediated by subjectivity, and that in different ways, all subjectivity is mediated by objectivity for Hegel, Marx, and Lukács. Sartre objects by arguing that while the mediations in the Hegelian Marxist tradition set great store by an eventual reappropriation of the objective world by a revolutionary collective spirit, i.e. Hegelian Geist materialized as the proletariat, it is forgotten that it is precisely the world of objects that is opposed to revolutionary practice. For example, there is something fundamentally flawed about the idea of the TV workers seizing control of their TVs, since most people only need one television, and more to the point, most of the programs are idiotic. In a manner analogous to Marx's idea that the working class cannot lay hold of the ready-state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, for Sartre it is mistaken to suppose that the world of objects is there to be seized as if this would consummate the revolution. It is not merely that objects like commodities acquire a life of their own when they go into commercial circulation. Some workers resist capitalist production relations, but many objects also resist reappropriation because of their practico-inertness. They are loaded with meanings and cultural significations that have a history of their own. Another way of saying this is that they are embedded in a series of other material objects and historical events, as Sartre puts it in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. In many capitalist societies, what is produced is enmeshed in an ideological and material web of relations. He suggests that it is hopeless to attempt to reappropriate the object by simply fishing it out of the series of relations within which that object is embedded, and then wielding that object for more emancipated aims. This is an example of reification rather than its antidote. Sartre's legacy is somewhat mixed. To a certain extent, existentialist Marxism may seem to many to be indissolubly linked to the 1950s and 1960s in post-war France and the intellectual circles of the Paris left bank that have long since dispersed. Yet Sartre's influence on the work of more recent theorists is unmistakably present both in and outside universities. His notion of the materiality of language is reminiscent of Foucault's The Words and Things, and he also deploys a very Foucauldian concept of resistance. Elements of his analysis of fields of power and the cultural significance of material objects clearly anticipate Pierre Bourdieu's ideas on habitus, field, and cultural capital. Sartre's belief that there is not, quote, philosophy, end quote, as such, but rather philosophies, which create new concepts that change the nature of social struggle and the state of epistemological inquiry itself, is evocative of the stance adopted by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in What is Philosophy? He is neither a traditional nor an organic intellectual in Gramsci's sense, for while he does abandon the role of the traditional intellectual to put his ideas in the service of the revolution, Sartre reserves the right to back the party when he wants to and to criticize the party vehemently when he does not. This sets him apart from Brecht's and Lukács's steadfast adherence to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. For Louis Althusser, however, Sartre existentialist Marxism represents a retreat to idealism and humanism. Like Korsch in Marxism and Philosophy, Althusser seeks to bypass various interpretations of Marx with the aim of returning to a close reading of Marx's text. Yet, unlike Korsch, who reminds his readers of the Hegelian background to historical materialism, Althusser is convinced that Marx only really assumes a rigorously scientific approach from 1845 onwards. The shift from the early writings on Hegel and Feuerbach to the mature writings on political economy represents what he refers to as a, quote, epistemological break, end quote, in two key works published in 1965 for Marx and Reading Capital. Althusser's explicit critique of Hegelian Marxism contains an implicit critique of a number of ideas of Korsch, Gramsci, Sartre about the relationship between consciousness and revolution. While it is possible to regard the latter as three exponents of Western Marxism in the tradition of Feuerbach, Hegel, and the radical humanism of the young Marx, is precisely the young Marx who Althusser dismisses as pre-scientific. His rejection of humanism, empiricism, historicism, as well as his qualified rejection of the base and superstructure model must be understood in the light of the rise of structuralist modes of explanation prevalent in post-war France. Althusser's work is deeply influenced by the ideas of the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, born in 1908, the linguist Roman Jakobson, who lived from 1896 to 1982, and especially the psychoanalytic method of Jacques Lacan, who lived from 1901 to 1981. In some ways, Lacan's work prefigures the, quote, linguistic turn, end quote, of social and political thought associated with Jürgen Habermas and Habermas's critique of the philosophy of consciousness, directed at the ideas of Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and Marx. But in contrast to the humanist ideas of Habermas's theory of communicative action, the line of thought from Lacan to Foucault and Althusser leads to structuralist and post-structuralist notions of the end of the traditional epistemological subject inaugurated with the philosophies of Descartes and Kant. It has been seen that Heidegger and Sartre proceed from an analysis of Dasein and existence rather than human essence or a, quote, made to know, end quote, epistemological subject. Similarly, Lacan argues that the subject is not sovereign in any significant sense, but on the contrary constituted by forces internal and external to it. Just as Sartre posits an inevitable discrepancy between ontological being in itself and human being for itself, Lacan observes a lack at the core of the subject. This is a departure from the modern subject, centered first in consciousness and then in labor and other forms of action, as well as a departure from the more ancient subject, centered in a soul of the Middle Ages. Lacan distinguishes between the imaginary, symbolic, and real levels of existence and explains the lack determining the experience of the subject in terms of its inability to explain the real with words, symbolic, or images, imaginary. According to a theory with a major influence on Althusser's notion on the role of the economy in scientific Marxism, Lacan holds that the real reveals itself to the subject in terms of its absence rather than as a presence. This means that there is no single center of the self which determines that self's peripheral limits. For Lacan, the self is overdetermined by a protean combination of imaginary, symbolic, and real functions. For Althusser, the economy is overdetermined by a multiplicity of political and ideological factors that have their own reality in the sense that they are not epiphenomenal illusions created by the base that give rise to false consciousness or bad faith. Hence, structural determination by the economy is only possible as a, quote, absent cause, end quote. Moreover, the entire idea of consciousness, false or otherwise, should be dispensed with as a relic of idealism and humanism. Because it does not determine culture or the state in a monocausal fashion, but is itself overdetermined, the economy is a structure in domination rather than a base that mechanically, quote, causes, end quote, a superstructure. The mechanical understanding of a base causing a political and ideological superstructure is symptomatic of an empiricist methodology. that pursues a core of truth, quote, behind, end quote, the veils of illusion surrounding him. For Althusser, it is also part of a Hegelian heritage that tends to regard the social whole as an expressive totality in which all observable phenomena can be seen as effects of a central nodal point that invests all instances of institutional mediation between humanity and nature. Althusser is not concerned with adjusting his theoretical understanding between base and superstructure in order to accommodate superstructural phenomenon like Bonapartism and fascism. To judge the validity of a methodology in this way is both empiricist and historicist. One should not judge the scientific status of a theory by actual historical events such as World War or fascism, but rather by conceptual rigor. Since the data of science are mediated by concepts, it is much more important that the concepts relate to each other in a rigorous way that yields knowledge in the form of theoretical practice. He casts theoretical practice in opposition to what he regards as the humanist concern with the correct dialectical relation between theory and practice one finds in Hegel, the young Marx, Gramsci, and Lukács. Althusser suggests that a humanist conception of Marxism is likely to yield at worst Christian pity for the poor, and at best some existentialist notion of commitment or sincerity. These are pre-scientific attitudes rather than a scientific position or a problematic, as Althusser calls it. Despite his implicit critique of Gramsci's residual historicist and Hegelian humanism, Althusser builds on Gramsci's enlarged notion of the state as comprising civil society as well as political society. In Lenin and Philosophy, published in 1971, Althusser distinguishes between ideological state apparatuses, ISAs, broadly corresponding to Gramsci's conception of civil society, and repressive state apparatuses, RSAs, corresponding to Gramsci's notion of political society. One of the somewhat puzzling dimensions of this argument is that despite the distinction he makes between science and ideology, he holds that human relations are always engulfed in ideology. Hence, one must suppose that in communist society, ideology is somehow more transparent or less repressive than it is in other social forms. This would seem to contradict the anti-historicist polemic against evaluating a theory by its ability to become real in practice. In Lacanian terms, Althusser presumably regards the abandonment of a possible substitution of truthful science for ideological domination as the unavoidable consequence of the irreconcilability of the symbolic and imaginary with the real. Hence, where historicism tends to relativize truth in history, Althusser's Marxist structuralism tends to relativize truth in the indeterminacy of overdetermined pluricausality. Since the economic moment of determination is crucial and nonetheless only visible in terms of its absence, it is not even possible to achieve reconciliation between humanity and nature in a communist society. As will be seen in the next chapter, it is their reconciliation that the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School pursue. This final note of criticism is not intended to detract from Althusser's originality and importance as a critical reader of Marx. While a number of his ideas are contradictory or polemical, his influence extends to theorists such as Nikos Poulantzas in France, as well as a number of Marxist historians in Britain, some of whom regard his ideas as important enough to disagree with in the strongest possible terms. The point already made in relation to Gramsci and some of the other figures in Western Marxism considered in this chapter is twofold. On the one hand, there can be no doubt that Marxism needs updating. On the other hand, it is also clear that Marxism is capable of entering into a critical dialogue with idealism, existentialism, psychoanalysis, and structuralism while remaining committed to the idea that in a society in which all of its members are freed from socioeconomically produced necessity can be characterized as free and genuinely democratic. Lukács may have felt compelled to choose Hegel and Marx against Nietzsche and existentialism, but Sartre shows that one need not choose definite sides in that debate and can nonetheless be an activist, if not a revolutionary in the usual sense implied by the lives of figures such as Che Guevara. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, who lived from 1928 to 1967. After a chapter on Marx and Western Marxism, this study now proceeds to other currents of thinking and action working toward a more emancipated society. The non-Marxist left continually defines and redefines its position with regard to Marx, but it can never ignore Marxism entirely as long as humanity's relations with nature continue to be mediated by the system Marx so rigorously analyzed, i.e., the system that makes the overcoming of socioeconomically produced necessity largely a matter of luck and privilege.